Hey students, this is Mr. Moore and I'm back with you for another AP European History review session to help you get ready for the AP European History test. Today we're going to be covering Unit 2, the Age of Reformation from 1450 to 1648. We're using the Key Concept Study Guide to guide us along, and today's lesson is going to be about topic 2.2, Luther and the Protestant Reformation. If there's one single person that starts and really is the head of this Reformation movement, it of course is Martin Luther. In my class, I really try to help students remember, and maybe this seems silly, but try to help them remember that we're talking about Martin Luther, who lived about 500 years ago, a white guy from what's present-day Germany, as opposed to what most Americans think about when they hear Martin Luther. They think about Martin Luther King Jr., who lived, some 50 years ago, who was a black minister, a Protestant minister. A lot of people called him the Reverend Martin Luther King. He also called him Dr. Martin Luther King because he had a doctor of philosophy and theology, an honorary one anyways, given to him. And what we'd like to do today is make sure we don't get confused about those two. And we'd like to jump into the Protestant Reformation and make sure all of us understand Luther and the Protestant Reformation. Topic 2.1 lays a lot of the background information that a person would need to get into this. You're encouraged to know a lot about Christianity in this class because it's such a focus in European history. It's almost impossible to dissect the two, European history from Christianity. This class is not designed to promote Christianity or to tell you which version of Christianity is right, but we are supposed to help the students understand how much Christianity impacts our society and our culture. And so without further ado, we're going to dive into this study guide and try to use it to coach us along. I'll pull in some geography to help remind us where and what we're talking about. I'll also be bringing in some visual aids from past lectures that we've done in order to help students, to the best of our ability, understand all about the Protestant Reformation. The learning objective here, learning objective B, says, explain how and why religious beliefs and practices changed during this time period of 1450 to 1648. So here's the two main reformers. Reformers Martin Luther and John Calvin criticized Catholic abuses and established new interpretations of Christian doctrine and practice. Responses to Luther and Calvin included religious radicals, including the Anabaptists and other groups such as German peasants. So one of the things that we're going to find is there is going to be a giant, huge peasant revolt that happens because of this whole dialogue that's going to happen. Some of the things that are going to happen. One of the things is a peasant revolt that happens right after Luther challenges the church. Peasants are going to take it upon themselves to challenge the political authority. They kind of see this idea of religious freedom as the idea that they could challenge and push for freedom in the rest of their lives. It's going to be a bloody time of conflict. People are going to die by the millions. Anabaptists are going to be hung from trees and disemboweled because they go against their traditional Catholic beliefs. Anabaptists are Protestants who believe that baptism is only valid when the candidate confesses his or her faith in Christ and wants to be baptized. You see, in the Catholic Church, people are baptized right when they're born because there's this Catholic idea that if you're not baptized, you're going to go straight to hell. And so babies are baptized in the Catholic faith. And this Anabaptism was really about a rebaptism. Like if you're old enough to really understand Christianity, then you can make that that choice in and of yourself. I've been using Google Maps a lot in these reviews, of course, showing the modern day country boundaries in Europe and encouraging students to know their geography really well. But it's also helpful to remember that what Europe looked like back during this time period of 1450 to 1648 was definitely different. And so you can go and Google Maps, find maps like this, or you can come to my notes and find yourself looking at different maps that we'll be using as we get in to understand this whole era of Reformation. Okay? Some Protestant groups sanctioned the notion that wealth accumulation was a sign of God's favor and a reward for hard work. And so a lot of Protestants are going to use the fact that they're economically successful to prove that they have God's favor. And thus they're going to use that as kind of a tool to prove that their version of Christianity is right. There are several illustrative examples of the period, things that people need to understand in order to understand the Protestant Reformation. New Protestant interpretations of Christian doctrine. I suppose this might be the point where we come back and talk about Martin Luther for a few minutes and remind you that Luther himself was a Catholic priest. He loved the church, and when I say the church, I mean the Catholic Church. What he didn't love was the corruption that he saw in the church. And he saw different kind of corruptions, and what he wanted to do was return the Catholic Church to what we might want to say original Christianity, or a return to biblical Christianity. What Luther said is, he said, when I read the Bible, which of course was just becoming more available to people because of the printing press. Just a little side note, the most printed book on the printing press was the Bible. The Gutenberg Bible, right? The guy who maybe invented the first printing press in Europe in the 1450s. The first thing that they did was print thousands and thousands of copies of the Bible, and this made the Bible more available to people in Europe. And then to go a step further, there were some people like Luther who started to make the Bible available in vernacular languages. He's going to make the Bible available in plain German instead of Latin, so that regular people could read. And so this whole era of Reformation is going to increase literacy. The printing press is going to promote ideas, like Luther is going to print thousands of tracts of what he wants to reform in the Christian church and spread it throughout Europe. And so those are some of the pieces of the puzzle, these Protestant interpretation. So when we're talking about Luther and his ideas, remember that he didn't hate the Catholic Church. He just hated the corruption he saw in the Catholic Church. He had no intention, really, of starting his own church, just to fix the problems he saw within the Catholic Church. And the number one problem that he saw in the Catholic Church, of course, is going to be something called indulgences. And indulgences is something we're going to get to here in just a few minutes. So I don't want to jump the gun too much on that one. But indulgences is an idea in the Catholic Church. They were trying to raise money to build cathedrals and fund church-related activities. And so they were going around and promising people that they could receive forgiveness of sins if they paid a certain amount of money. And this really offended Luther more than anything else. The Catholic Church is also doing a lot of nepotism, that is giving positions in the church to family members. And absenteeism, where somebody, a Catholic leader, is in charge of an area where they don't live and don't have any connection to. And so the local people don't feel like they're being represented and their needs aren't being met. So there's a lot of ideas, like simony, where church offices were being sold, but there's a lot of corruption. And so these new Protestant interpretations of Christian doctrine and practices, the priesthood of all believers, this is an idea that Luther really preached. The idea that a person does not need a priest to commune with God, but can access heavenly power directly. If people could read the Bible for themselves, they would want to return to true Christianity. The church has no power over salvation. Salvation only comes through faith in Christ. That was the idea. Where the Catholic Church said you needed priests to administer ordinances and sacraments and communions, that was a part of the whole challenge between Protestant ideas and Catholic ideas. Another one of the key points here is the primacy of the scriptures. As Martin Luther said, sola scriptura. Sola in Latin means only. So the only source of truth is the scriptures, not the church. That's totally straight from Martin Luther's ideas. That was one of the things he thought, that the Christian church had kind of strayed. They had incorporated a whole bunch of stuff over time that wasn't found in the scriptures. In fact, Christian doctrine must be backed by the Bible, not church traditions. The only sacraments that are biblical are the Eucharist and baptism, or that's like sometimes people call it the sacrament or the Lord's Supper. It's bread and wine generally, or in modern times some people use bread and water. They take that in remembrance of Jesus' body and blood, and of course baptism. Other than those two things, Martin Luther said everything else that we're doing in the Catholic Church is not scriptural, and thus it should be eliminated. Those are the only two things that he could find in the Bible that the modern church at his time, the Catholic Church, was doing. He said all the other little, ornate rituals that we're doing are not necessary. And so he was trying to get people back to original Christianity. Just think about that for a minute in context with the whole Renaissance idea. People were returning back to the original Greek and Roman literature and Greek and Roman art. And Renaissance writers and readers who wanted to study Christianity wanted to read the Bible in the original language, right? So there's always this returning to antiquity. So I know that this is totally different, but it really is the same. People are wanting to return to original Christian values, teachings, and ideas. And that's really what this Reformation is, trying to reform and, well, in a sense, fix the church. Both Martin Luther and John Calvin believed in the idea of predestination, although John Calvin was the biggest proponent of this doctrine, as it says right here. The opposite of the Renaissance humanist idea of free will, that man has agency to choose. That's the opposite of predestination. Predestination, God has already chosen who will receive salvation. Okay? Luther and a lot of Protestants believed in this idea, and that kind of was another doctrinal difference from Old Catholicism, where Old Catholicism would say that people have this choice to make. And John Calvin said, God's already chosen who's going to be saved. And so some people didn't like that idea. I would like to point out that not all Protestants believe in predestination. There is a lot of Protestants who believe in free will. So we shouldn't think that all Protestants believed in predestination, but that was definitely one of John Calvin's main teachings, because he would say God knows everything from the beginning to the end, and thus he already knows who's going to be saved. That kind of an idea. Here's another one of the three solas that Martin Luther preached. Salvation by faith alone. It's called sola fide, by faith alone. Luther promoted this idea that only faith can bring salvation, not good works. Not ceremonies of the church, not these, but only faith alone brings salvation. So there's actually three solas. There's sola scriptura, only the scriptures hold the source of truth. There's sola fide, by faith alone. And then there's sola gratia, so only by grace, only by the grace of God. That's the other sola that he talked about. The last part of this review right here, and again, this is for topic 2.2, Luther and the Protestant Reformation. This right here says that Protestants who viewed wealth as a sign of God's favor, the Calvinists, followers of John Calvin, a major Protestant reformer, influential in France. and Geneva, Switzerland. So maybe I'm going to pause here for a second and go to this map of Europe. Obviously, I think it's obvious, most of the people who speak French in Europe are within the political boundaries of modern-day France. However, there are a lot of French speakers. About half of Belgium, the Wallonia half, is French-speaking. There's quite an influence of French in Luxembourg, although it's also quite Germanic, so it's kind of got its own linguistical issue, and that's why it's its own country right there. But Switzerland is the other place I'd like to point out. Switzerland actually has several official languages. The people who live in southern Switzerland speak Italian. The people who live over here in the western part of Switzerland speak French. And the people who live in the eastern part of Switzerland speak German. Those are the predominant languages of Switzerland. It's a very multilinguistic country. And so John Calvin was really big in France. That's where he kind of got his roots, in France. And then, interestingly enough, France and Scotland had a lot of ties together because the Scottish hate the English. Historically, the English were always running over the Scottish and trying to subjugate them and push their agenda on Scotland. And so the Scottish and the English had a lot of animosity towards each other over time. And the French and the English also have a huge conflict over time. And so thus the French and the Scottish saw a common enemy in England. And that's why Calvinism also takes root in Scotland quite a bit as well. That's the connection right there. So Calvin's most famous work was Institutes of the Christian Religion, a book that he wrote while trying to make Geneva, Switzerland like a Christian haven. He actually tried to turn it into a theocracy right here, okay? So modern Presbyterian, a few other Protestant denominations took his doctrine as foundation of their churches, and Geneva is a city in the French part of Switzerland. John Calvin tried to establish a theocracy, a religious-based government, and required people to live by a strict interpretation of Christian doctrine. And so you can read all about that in my notes. And if you want to Google that up more, but that's the general gist. Martin Luther really is the guy who starts this whole Protestant Reformation. There was people who came before him who laid the groundwork, definitely. All right, Deterius Erasmus, maybe even John Huss. There were some of those guys who kind of paved the path beforehand. William Tyndale also was working on translating the Bible into other languages. So Martin Luther doesn't act alone, but he's kind of guy who gets the ball rolling. And then John Calvin might have a more lasting impact, honestly, in the end, than even Martin Luther. But that kind of gives us the basic start to understanding the Protestant Reformation. Thanks for joining me, and we'll be back with the next topic from Unit 2, The Age of Reformation.